Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I have your attention? Thank you very much. So, my name is Peter Matheson, and for 4 weeks I have been the principal of the University of Edinburgh. So I'm still very much the newcomer, and it feels slightly odd to me to welcome people to Edinburgh when I've only just arrived myself. But welcome to those of you that are from outside Edinburgh, and welcome to those of you that are returners to the University of Edinburgh, and indeed to the Gifford Lecture series. I know we have at least one former Gifford lecturer here, probably more. So you're all very welcome, and it's my pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker. I think well known to many of you, Professor Agustín Fuentes, and I'll get the title right. He's the Edmund P. Joyce Professor of Anthropology at the University of what I'm going to pronounce as Notre Dame, but I know that's not the way the locals in Indiana pronounce it. And the theme for tonight is why we believe evolution, making meaning, and the development of human natures. So this is the fourth lecture in the series, and how do we believe developing human culture? And as many of you will be aware, this is a change to what was advertised, and this is because of last week's weather, which I'm also told is very unusual in Edinburgh. Although when I was working in Hong Kong before I came here, and everyone that knew I was moving from Hong Kong to Edinburgh teased me relentlessly about how I was going to be cold and I was going to need new clothes, and I didn't really take it very seriously. And it was within no time of me arriving, there's snow on the ground, so I should have listened. So this is a change. The fifth lecture, which was originally due to be this evening, will now be held tomorrow evening at New College, Mound Place. So, and there are details on the Gifford Lectures web pages for those of you that haven't seen it. And then the final lecture in the series will return to this hall on Thursday evening. So I hope that's what you're expecting, Agustín. Is that right? Good, I've got it right. The lecture and the question time will be recorded, and the video will be available later on the university's Gifford Lectures web pages. And so without further ado, I want to hand you over to Professor Fuentes for the latest of the Gifford Lectures. Welcome.
In his recent Gifford Lecture, Rowan Williams, Lord Williams of Ostermouth, draws our attention to a nearly 40,000-year-old figure of a lion man. He uses it to exemplify humankind's ability not just to represent things, but to think things anew and create material realities for these new thinkings. To paraphrase the anthropologist Ashley Montagu, it is this ability to imagine truly new things and ideas and to make them into resoundingly material reality that marks humanity as distinctive. Lord Williams specifies this as the capacity to depict one thing such that it speaks of another. He argues that the very fact of this lion man figurine indicates beings capable of imagining new concepts rather than simply reproducing existing forms. Beings capable of belief. In the first lecture, I stated that belief is the human capacity to imagine, to be creative, to hope and dream, to infuse the world with meanings, and to cast our aspirations far and wide, limited neither by personal experience nor material reality. That believing is a commitment, an investment, a devotion to possibilities, and that beliefs permeate neurobiologies, bodies, and ecologies, acting as dynamic agents in evolutionary processes. Lectures 2 and 3 outline the evolutionary history of the human niche, setting up the context and processes for the emergence of the capacity for belief. We ended by illustrating how recent changes in the world and ourselves, including domestication, property, inequality, created dramatic shifts in social, political, and economic landscapes, establishing the core infrastructure for human belief today. The capacity for belief has evolved in the human lineage, and belief is a core part of the human niche. But we've not yet discussed how we believe. How do we, in Lord Williams' terms, depict one thing such that it speaks of another, or as per Montagu, imagine truly new things and ideas and make them into resoundingly material reality? How do humans believe? Well, it should surprise no one that at the heart of this process of how we generate, embody, and produce belief is that very human reality of culture. Let me be clear. To state that the answer to how we believe is culture is not a superficial statement, nor one so general that it is useless. Most people greatly underestimate just what human culture is and how such a system functions. Culture is not just the regional flavors of humanity, nor is culture the nurture to a biological nature. Culture is a dynamic web of significance at the core of becoming human. Culture is both the product of human actions and something that shapes these actions. Culture is the context, the framework, the milieu that helps give meaning to our experience in the world and to embody them physiologically, neurobiologically, emotionally, philosophically, and faithfully. Culture is, as the biologist Kevin Leyland recently wrote, what makes the human mind possible. It is through our capacity for human culture that we can believe in the ways that we do. Of course, human culture is not something that is easily grasped, studied, or examined. In this lecture, I will elaborate on what human culture is, how it emerged, and why it is central to the process of belief. We humans are born into a world of existing social and physical ecologies, patterns, institutions, dogmas, and contexts that become entangled with our biological structures even before we leave the womb. To invoke the anthropologist Tim Ingold, humans constantly and complexly become throughout their lives. For humans, culture is simultaneously the ecosystem we navigate and the embodied and perceived substance that facilitates our actions and thoughts. Humans are thoroughly creative of and created by the processes that we collapse under this term, culture, but do not for a moment think that I am using this term culture in opposition to the term biology. When we think about humans, it is a mistake to think that our biology exists without our cultural experience and that our cultural selves are not constantly entangled, enmeshed, co-constituted with, by, and in our biology. Do not fall into the fallacious trap of nature versus nurture. There are not two halves to being human, two processes that interface mutually but can be disentangled and itemized for their additive contribution to our eventual whole. We are simultaneously biological cultural beings with complex schemata and social lives shaped and populating our perceptions and philosophies. The dynamism of this engagement forms my central argument. How we believe is explicitly an aspect and outcome of human culture. Thus, a fuller understanding of how we believe lies in the elaboration of how human cultural processes function. To unpack these assertions, we need to clarify what culture is, whether it is truly distinctive of humans. Then we need to identify where culture comes from and how it works. And with that under our belts, we can then describe how human culture makes belief possible. In 1871, E.B. Tyler defined culture as, and I quote, that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired as a member of society. More than 50 years later, Franz Boas, one of the most prominent early 20th century anthropologists, noted, culture embraces all the manifestations of social habits of a community, the reactions of the individuals affected by habits of the group in which they live, and the products of human activities as determined by these habits. In 1952, the anthropologists Alfred Kroeber and Clyde Cuckholm reviewed a sizable portion of the Western scholarly treatment of culture from which they extracted 164 definitions. They synthesized the range of concepts into what they hoped would be the seminal anthropological definition of culture, which probably no one actually uses now. Culture consists of patterns, explicit and implicit, of and for behavior, acquired and transmitted by symbols, constituting the distinctive achievement of human groups, including their embodiments in artifacts. The essential core of culture consists of traditional, that is, historically derived and selected ideas, and especially their attached values. Cultural systems may, on one hand, be considered as products of action, on the other hand, as conditioning elements of further action. One can certainly see how in this definition, or rather description of culture, culture is the central factor of the human niche, the ubiquitous semiotic ecosystem in which humans exist. But given what we know in 2018, can we state unequivocally that culture described in this way is really unique to humans? Over the past 50 to 60 years, there's been increased attention to the presence of social traditions in other animals. Social traditions are behavioral practices acquired through social exposure and facilitation, but not clearly rooted in specific genetic or biological causes. Recently, scholars from across multiple disciplines focusing on these social traditions in other animals have urged a broader consideration of the possibility that at least in a few other species, particularly highly social mammals such as primates and cetaceans, culture exists. But if culture facilitates belief in humans and other animals have culture, do they also believe? The animal behaviorist and cognitive scientist Andrew Whiten created a taxonomy of 3 key elements to consider when looking for and at culture. First, the pattern distribution of traditions in space and time. Second, social learning as central in acquiring such traditions. And third, the content of those social traditions, the actions, the materials, the ideas, etc. Under this rubric, humans vary more widely than other animals in the specifics of the third category, the content of social traditions, and have heightened complexity relative to other animals in the first 2. In a similar process of definition, the philosopher Grant Ramsey argues that culture is information that is socially transmitted between individuals or groups such that it brings about changes in behavior and/or patterns of tradition. In these descriptions, culture is not unique to humans. However, there's a problem with this more inclusive approach, one that places culture on a continuum of less to more complex animal societies, while by no means stating that other animals do not have complex societies and culture. It is critical to place human societies, human culture, and our material, ecological, and technological impact on the planet in context. To define culture as information that is socially transmitted between individuals or groups that brings about changes in behavior and/or patterns of tradition makes a good point for comparison of lifeways across species, but misses or risks glossing over critical processes and structures in what humans actually do, in the particulars of the human niche, especially ones relevant to belief. If we are truly interested in generating insight into how humans are in the world, and thus how we believe, then direct comparison to other species might not fill out the picture as much as needed. Take, for example, this cartoon from the artist Dan Peraro. I'll give you a few minutes to take it in. You can look to the lower right-hand corner to find the joke. The joke is that a chimpanzee has turned the tables on the famous Jane Goodall and is now studying her and her family community just as she studied chimpanzees. This is a classic ethological approach to recording the behavior of others, direct observation of their social lives, and the recording of their behavior. In this manner, we have discovered in apes, monkeys, whales, dolphins, elephants, wolves, and even some bird species, patterns that fit the definition of culture as a continuum model of the structure, the complexity, and the intensity of social traditions. But even with a little reflection, it should be obvious that we gain only a partial amount of what is needed for deep insight into human lives by simply observing them. Just watching humans does not give us very much insight into why they do what they do, or even how they do it. The human niche, our ubiquitous semiotic ecosystem, our Umwelt, the ways in which we embody, navigate, create, and perceive our world, is completely intertwined with language, socially mediated and reconstructed history, institutions, and beliefs. Much of what we do is not understandable or inferable from our overt behavior. What humans do often has little directly observable, simply interpretable, or even conscious connection to why we do things. To talk about culture in humans is to speak of a different but overlapping suite of experiences, processes, and patterns compared to what we might term culture in other organisms. Think about it. Chimpanzees are amazing beings on this planet. They have a range of fascinating social traditions: stone tool nut cracking, leaf cup using, termite fishing, incredible manipulations of their environment. They have incredible social capacities, complex social hierarchies, deep social relationships, complex group conflict with other communities. But they don't have cash economies and political institutions. They don't arrest and deport one another. They don't create massive systems of material and social inequity, change planet-wide ecosystems, build cities and airplanes, drive thousands of other species towards extinctions, or give Gifford lectures. But humans do. If culture is a process that appears in many species in the animal kingdom, then human culture is an exceptional variant on this theme, a particular niche that is distinctive given our evolutionary history. The anthropologist Tim Ingold, drawing on the philosophers José Ortega y Gasset, Deleuze and Guattari, Ramon Lull, and many others, offers us a particular insight into how we can think with and about humans and our ubiquitous cultural ecosystem. Ingold tells us that the grammatical form of the human is not that of the subject, whether nominal or pronominal, but that of the verb. We become human constantly and actively with, alongside, and through human culture. Actively, alongside, through, and with human culture. When thinking about human culture, it is not sufficient to define culture as something humans do and or use. One must understand that it is us and we it, literally, a topic we will return to later in this lecture. In terms of a working context, let us establish then that the notion that for humans, culture is a central process in our niche, and as Pierre Bourdieu notes when describing human habitus, this process consists of structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures. The line I force all my students to learn, and they still hate. Structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures. For humans, culture is simultaneously the ecosystem we navigate through and an embodied and perceived ubiquitous substance that facilitates our actions and thoughts at the same time we use, shape, and create it. But when did such a culture emerge? Culture cannot fossilize, but reflections, products, and impacts of human activity, perception, and belief are reflections of aspects of human culture and do leave material evidence on occasion. We can look to our past for evidence of elements of the human niche in the world. We can then use those material fragments of the past in attempts to piece together more or less when different core aspects of what we humans do today, things that make us so distinctive and are central to the process by which we believe came to be. In previous lectures, I offered a brief summary of the first appearances and evidence for a variety of material items, behaviors, and patterns as they are currently reflected in the archaeological and fossil records. I return to that here. From the 19th century through today, it has been common amongst archaeologists and a range of anthropologists, philosophers, and many others to peg the start of true humanity and true human culture to the appearance of clearly characteristic human behaviors, ones that seem to necessitate language, evidence of cave painting or other art, jewelry or other modes of self-adornment, and particular patterns of hunting and complex food use, evident from material items left behind, were all held to indicate that the bearers of human culture, what are frequently called modern Homo sapiens, had emerged on the scene. But it is evident from this overview of the human record that I've presented previously, various aspects of the patterns and processes involved in human culture emerge at different times across our history, coalescing into more or less the contemporary cluster in the past few 100,000 years, but by no means stopping. We have been and are evolving, and we will continue to do so. To paraphrase another Gifford lecturer, Bruno Latour, we have never been modern humans. We are humans evolving past, present, and future. Or to go back to Tim Ingold, we are constantly becoming human and have been throughout our history and will continue to do so into the future. It's just that recently, we do it in more complex ways than in the past. During the past 500,000 years, it is quite clear that the various elements of what we all agree upon as being human culture emerge. Sometimes they died out almost immediately. Other times they spread across a few populations of early humans and occasionally across many. As we came closer to our current place in time, we see more and more evidence of the spread and maintenance of such patterns and behaviors. The appearance of human culture, like human bodies, is evolutionary, emerging in fits and starts across great periods of time, eventually coalescing into its contemporary form, but always becoming, never just being. At this point, I'm surprised no one in the audience has yelled out the obvious. What about language? We know that becoming human today is inextricably bound to our capacity for language, and that the use, deployment, and immersion in language is the most distinctively human of all things. We humans today are inextricably bound to language for everything we do, think, and believe. The very fact of the Gifford Lectures attests to this. Many have suggested that it is when we have human language that human culture truly begins, that humanity becomes rational, deploys reason in the view of so many philosophers. In such a case, how we believe is truly rooted in how we speak, think, and write. While this is in large part accurate for today, it cannot be so for the past. Language itself does not fossilize, but its development and the initiation of a human immersion in what the anthropologist Alan Barnard calls the signifying revolution plays a central role in human evolution. So, what can we actually say with data about language and culture in the deep past? We know that the capacity to produce the range of sounds needed for human language is found in many of our closest living relatives, the living apes, and thus was present in our proto-human ancestors due to our shared ancestry with ape lineages. We also have robust evidence that the ear canal of human ancestors had developed into the form that is most effective at hearing and isolating the sounds of speech, the pitch and frequency, by at least 400,000 years ago, and that these particular morphologies are not found in apes or other hominins, other human ancestors. So we can be fairly certain that human ancestors could both produce and effectively hear the sounds of speech, key tools of language, by 400,000 years ago. Some researchers also point to certain genetic complexes, such as the FOXP2 sequences and related genetic sequences, that seem to be shifting at this time as additional signposts of the emergence of language. But the bulk of the evidence argues strongly against one or even a few language genes, or even a specific timestamp for the emergence of language. The physical structures, possibly the genetic structures, and some of the material indications of language are clearly present by 300,000 to 400,000 years ago in our lineage. But there is no definitive evidence of language until much more recently. We know that in the past 400,000 years, the human material record complexifies, and a majority of the items we see as reflecting human culture become more and more common as we get closer to contemporary times. What I suggest here is that language, just like humans, just like human culture, is becoming, not appearing. There was no proto-language that turned into language, but rather the capacity for language evolves in concert with the production and use of sounds, gestures, imagery, and a myriad of processes in the human niche. Language capacity and language itself must have evolved, and if they did, one would expect a development across time in concert with all of the other processes of an evolving human niche, not as something separable from them. Human culture and human language are covalent, intertwined in reciprocal causation, mutually restructuring, and both are necessary for humans' contemporary capacity for belief. None of the items in the human niche of culture, including our bodies and minds, are truly independent from one another. Culture is not a thing, nor is it a standalone system. It is a central process of the human niche. Okay. Now we know more or less what culture is and that it developed over evolutionary time. The final aspect of understanding the infrastructure for how we believe is to lay out specifically how culture works. The psychologist Michael Tomasello once said, "Fish are born expecting water, and humans are born expecting culture." He's right. A fish, over countless eons of evolutionary processes, has developed the relationships with and in water as central to every aspect of its becoming and develops accordingly. Similar mutual interfaces across the last 2 million years between human selves, communities, and our niches formed a relationship in which human development has evolved as a system that is always in concert with and mutually constitutive of the linguistic, socially mediated, and constructed structures, institutions, and beliefs that make up the human niche. Culture is part of our nature. But we are not predetermined or hardwired with some specific innate structures of culture. Rather, we are wired, if you will, to co-acquire them as we become. We are culture, and it is us across our entire lives. Rather than think of a human acquiring culture or developing a body, we can think of those aspects of the human as mutually entwined processes of becoming across the time span from the uterus to the grave. It is in these processes that we can see how culture works and how it enables humans to believe. 3 key parts of this process are enskillment, neuroendocrine development, and the human capacity to think offline and experience a true imaginary. Tim Ingold, drawing on a range of previous work, denotes enskillment as the embodiment of capacities of awareness and response by environmentally situated agents. And he elaborates. Neither innate nor acquired skills are grown, incorporated into the human organism through practice and training in an environment. They are thus as much biological as cultural. To account for the generation of skills, we have therefore to understand the dynamics of development. And this in turn calls for an ecological approach that situates practitioners in the context of an active engagement with the constituents of their surroundings. In short, the human niche is what the human grows into, with, and against simultaneously. This is a physical, cognitive, social, and potentially transcendent process. More on that last part in the next lecture. Human bodies and minds acquire particular motor skills and social skills. They embody specifics of a language, the modes of movement and behavior, the appropriate mannerisms, and the use and interface with clothing, foods, patterns of socialization, the rules, laws, customs, and details of what lies in the realm of our belief. And they are shaped by all of them. All of these are particular skills that humans acquire, use, and alter across their lifetimes. But they are not external features that are mapped onto a biological base. They are materially real, embedded and embodied in humans via the development of our neurobiology and the neuroendocrine system. The anthropologists Greg Downey and Daniel Lendy effectively summarized this process in the introduction to their book, Neuroanthropology. And I quote, "Neuroanatomy makes experience material. Neural systems adapt through long-term refinement and remodeling, which leads to learning, memory, maturation, even trauma. Through systematic change in the nervous system, the human body learns to orchestrate itself as well as it eventually does. Cultural concepts and meanings become anatomy. Rather than one set of genes or an overarching system of meaning, humans' capacity for abstract thought emerges equally from social and individual sources, built of public symbol, evolutionary endowment, social scaffolding, and private neurological achievements. The human experience, our becoming in our niche with human cultural processes, is literally co-constitutive of our neurobiology and endocrine systems. The neuroendocrine systems are those bodily systems responsible for maintaining homeostasis, regulating reproduction, metabolism, eating and drinking processes, energy utilization, osmolarity, and blood pressure in all organisms. In humans, these systems are well understood to be in constant mutual interface with social behavior, cultural institutions and processes, and, importantly, individual perceptions of social context. And the same is true for the makeup and function of our brain. The brain is a hyperdynamic organ intrinsically interconnected with all sensory and bodily apparatus, and shapes and is shaped by those relationships. We know from Lecture 2 that the expansion in size and complexity of the brain was a central facet in human evolution, opening up a myriad of possibilities for learning and innovation unavailable to most other organisms. The human brain is less than 30 or 40% of its adult size at birth, the lowest ratio known for mammals. And it undergoes organizational and reorganizational processes across the entire human lifespan. The fact that the majority of brain growth is postpartum in humans is a material indication of the critical role of mutual interplay between the constituents of the human niche and the development of processes throughout the human body necessary for the success of life. This is culture. Downey and Lendy are speaking literally, not metaphorically, when they state cultural concepts and meanings become anatomy. As we develop, our experiences and perceptions meld with our neuroendocrine system in a process of mutual shaping, developing an anatomy that is cultural. And that anatomy interacts with the world to reconstruct the very niche that shaped it. It is by this process that humans become throughout their lives. But it is not only our anatomy that interacts with the world. The human niche, our Umwelt, is a particularly dynamic, and part of the reason for this dynamism is the human capacity to be cognitively not limited by the material context in which we find ourselves. Like the fish swimming and becoming in water, humans are immersed and constitutive of a semiotic ecosystem that includes substantial symbolic components and a continuous potential for the imaginary, even the transcendent. Thus, unlike the fish, the shape of and boundaries to the human niche are not always material or physiologically perceptible. As I noted in the first lecture, humans can see the world around them, imagine how it might be different, and translate those imaginings into reality, or at least try to. It is clear that complex and not necessarily rooted in the material reality mental representations are part of this process, central to human culture, and especially salient in the context of thinking about humans' capacity for belief. To clarify this process, we need the third component, and that is a brief elaboration on the human capacity for mental representation. A mental representation is an internal cognitive sign that represents an external reality that has been at one time experienced, either in a moment or previously, or that makes use of some form of symbolic representation to create mental imagery of things that are not actually present and available to senses, or possibly have never been experienced in the past. For our discussion here, we're particularly interested in the human process of developing mental imagery for things that are not present, and especially those that have never been experienced, the human capacity for imagination. The cognitive scientist Peter Gardenfors and his colleagues uses the labels cued and detached mental representations in a manner that can help us understand this critical aspect of the human niche. Cued representation refers to something in the current external situation of the subject or something triggered by a current or recent item in the external environment. Immediate and delayed responses to tangible experiences are cued. Things that have been experienced and are cued into mental re-experience. For example, let's say I had a delicious apple a few days ago, and when I walked by the grocer's, I saw some fruit in the window. I then have a mental and actually physiological sensation recollection of the apple and the experience of consuming it. However, detached representations are objects or events that are not present in the subject's current or recent external context, and thus could not directly trigger the representation. Memories are evoked independently of context. That's one way we could get detached representation. However, memories can also be created that are not based on something that actually occurs in the external world. They can be imaginary. I may be daydreaming on a train, and a winged, tentacled creature, with an apple in this case, appears in the daydream, or maybe even an image of an animal I have no idea what it is. In either case, the mental images are largely detached from my material experiences. In order to have a detached representation, there must be the ability to at least primarily block out the current external context and sensations, to block out the specifics of the world around you. This is heavy duty for cognition, given the deep evolutionary importance of retaining connectivity to your material surroundings. Such a capacity is neurobiologically centered in the frontal lobes of the brain, the very location that underwent exceptionally distinctive elaboration during the last few million years in the human lineage. In humans, the frontal lobes constitute 30% of the entire cerebral cortex, more than in any other mammal. It is just one of the few locations, the frontal lobes, one of the few locations that differentially expanded over our evolutionary past, rather than just scaling up in size relative to other primates. The frontal lobes are implicated as critical in emotional, social, motivational, and perceptual processes in cognition for all mammals. And in particular, they are important in coordinating decision-making, attention, and working memory. In short, it appears that the human brain underwent, over our coevolution with our niche, specific structural transformation that enabled more effective and widespread detached mental representation, along with many other capacities. The philosopher of biology Kim Sterelny and the neuropsychologist Merlin Donald refer to this capacity as decoupled representation. And the previously invoked Michael Tomasello and his colleagues highlight this as a critical differentiating factor in the capacities of young humans to innovate and collaborate to solve tasks and to think very imaginatively and collaboratively. Gardenfors asserts that this capacity for detached self-awareness, where an agent has self-representations that concern her future or past conditions and can imagine herself as having different properties in different domains, paves the way for the self-ascription of properties that the agent does not in fact have, and thus for counterfactual reasoning about the self. These capacities combined enable humans to think in the here and now and to project herself into the future or alternative contexts where the external conditions and or the vision of self may be totally changed. If one combines this capacity with the diversity of geographies, ecologies, histories, and cultural experiences in human communities today, It is absolutely no wonder that, as the work by anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann and colleagues illustrates, human perceptions of self and others, their representations of the world around them, and their transcendent experiences associated with such perceptions can vary substantially across culture, specifically due to the fact of how these cultures, brains, and bodies work with and on one another, and how the specifics of cultures vary from place to place. Where we grow up and who we grow up with affects the details and structures of how and what we believe. Now, I recognize this has been a very dense explication of how culture works, which, as you might have noticed, is one and the same with a description of how humans become in and with the world, and offers significant insight into how we believe. The development of the human body and mind has evolved as a system where physiology and neurobiology are always in concert with and mutually co-constitutive of the linguistic, socially mediated, and constructed structures, institutions, and beliefs that make up key aspects of the human niche. This process is human culture. Let me summarize the details. Neurobiological and endocrine systems develop as humans learn to orchestrate themselves in a cultural context. Through this process, social concepts and meanings become an anatomy that in turn interfaces with and possibly reshapes those very social concepts and meanings. Skills, the specific patterns of how we use our bodies and minds, are grown, incorporated into the human organism through practice and training in a given environment. They are thus simultaneously biological and cultural and are contingent on the capacities and constraints of the development of our bodies and our relationships with one another and the cultural and material environments we are in. Because of the particular histories of neurobiological development and expansion of the human brain's frontal lobes and the processes and structures of human culture, humans have developed the capacity for extensive detached mental representation, a particularly powerful capacity for imagining. Thus, the shape of and boundaries to the human niche are not always material or bounded by cued representations. This enhanced capacity for detached representation and the complexity and diversity of our social and ecological milieus enables humans to experience, create, and even develop skills in perceptions and awareness that are highly diverse, not contingent on material reality, and thus may include transcendent experiences as central to the human niche. These processes of culture are a core component of the human niche and constitute the basis for how we believe. I asserted that belief is the human capacity to imagine, to be creative, to hope and dream, to infuse the world with meanings, and to cast our aspiration far and wide, limited neither by personal experience nor material reality. And that to believe is to make a commitment. The understanding of human culture I've outlined here illustrates the connections between human culture and our capacity for belief, and demonstrates that how we believe is specifically tied to distinctive processes of becoming that emerged across our evolutionary history. And it offers two critical insights for understanding why belief is so central to the human existence. The first, it's actually an anthropological dictum. Cultural constructs are real for those who hold them. To many, the statement that something is a cultural construct is often interpreted as meaning that it's not really real. That is, it's only an imaginary or socially agreed upon set of assumptions that have no material reality. That it is made up or all in the mind. This is wholly incorrect. There is no such thing as all in your mind for humans, because the mind is not just in your head, not just an ethereal imaginings or agreed upon external symbol. Your head, meaning our brain, is always part of the rest of your body, and all neurobiology, perception, and functioning of the neuroendocrine system is shaped and structured by the various internal and external inputs, which are in turn filtered and molded by the experience, skills, and beliefs one holds. By definition, a cultural construct is a specific conviction of a given cultural group that is widely shared among members of that cultural group and is thus part of their perceptual and physiological experience, as well as constitutive of the social ecology in which they exist. Therefore, specific beliefs by specific peoples, many of which are related to or derived from cultural constructs, are tied to our developmental processes and the mutual interfaces between our deeply cultural niche and the development of our bodies and minds. Cultural constructs are real for those who hold them. Thus, the second insight. For humans, what is and what should be critical components of every human belief system are in large part both contextualized and contingent on where and how we develop and are embedded in who we are and how we become. I hope that now you agree that a deeper understanding of human culture offers substantial insight into our capacities for and processes of belief. The integration of cultural processes, evolutionary histories, and how our bodies, our neurobiologies, develop in interface with our niche provides the core understanding of how we believe. To these insights on culture and belief, I add a coda as a lead-in to the next lecture. As the famous semiotician Charles Sanders Peirce put it, all the greatest achievements of the mind have been beyond the power of unaided individuals. That is, we seldom, if ever, develop beliefs alone. Culture, by definition, is a communal affair, and the how and what we believe is not just connected to the communities we participate in, but is shaped and facilitated by our extensive and obligate sociality. Such processes produce a particular pattern of social collaborative creativeness and imagination, a pattern we call belief systems. And among the most common and most powerful is that we generally call religion. This leads me to this evening's final assertion. Human culture and our obligatory immersion in belief enabled the capacity to be religious to emerge over our evolutionary history. And there are a number of evolutionarily recent events that facilitated the development of religion as a fixture of human identity. I believe that the capacity to be religious and the structure of contemporary religions are two separate yet connected narratives. And in the next lecture, I will offer what I hope is an innovative and yet still evolutionary explanation for why we believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agustín. That was terrific and very thought-provoking for someone that thought he understood human biology. So 100 questions from me, but I know there'll be questions from other people in the audience. So I just have a couple of notes to remind people. So you briefly trailed the next lecture. So the fifth lecture is entitled "Why Do We Believe? The Human Imagination and the Emergence of Belief Systems" is the theme again. And as I just said earlier on, this will be tomorrow evening at 5:30 at New College, so not here, but at New College in Man Place. And alongside these lectures, there's two other additional opportunities to engage with the questions and the themes. So this is the Gifford Seminar being held also tomorrow from 2:30 to 3:30 in the Elizabeth Templeton Lecture Theatre, also in New College in Man Place, where Professor Fuentes will be joined by Professor Wenzel van Hoystein, I hope I pronounced that correctly, James I. McCord, Professor of Theology and Science Emeritus, Princeton Theological Seminary and former Gifford Lecturer, and Professor William Storer, Director of the Center for Theological Inquiry at Princeton University. These three will discuss questions from the audience arising from this lecture series, and details are available on the web page. So you're also welcome to contribute to the online discussion on the Gifford Lectures blog, and the address is at the back of your series leaflet and on our Gifford Lectures web pages.
Hi, thank you very much for your lecture. I was particularly interested in your comments on language and its relationship to earlier forms of communication. Would it be fair to say that language is just a complicated form of gesture, or is there something more going on there?
I think that's a wonderful question, and professionally I have spent much of my career avoiding the evolution of language argument because sans time machine, it's really, really a difficult one to pitch. The problem is language is so distinctive. It of course involves gestural processes and vocal processes that are found in other organisms, and humans seem to have co-opted not just primate sort of patterns, but generated what look like maybe analogous properties to some others, a bird song and other things like that. So I think language, and the reason I make a point of saying rather than language having evolved at one point, that it's a process, because I think the inputs to language are much more diverse and complex than other vocal or gestural communication systems taken alone. So I think language is best seen as part of the human niche and part of the system of development rather than a particular trait. I know that's not a very exciting answer, but I think looking as we understand the physiology of language and the psychology of language more effectively, I think the capacities to model a diverse, dynamic evolutionary process of something like language will be better. I just don't think we're there yet.
Hi there. I wonder if you could say something more about representation as it comes to thinking about other human beings and cooperation. So is it the case of, if I consider that you've got a consciousness, even though I can't experience it, I'm sort of imagining that you've got a consciousness, does that have a bearing on my ability to consider you to be a friend or an enemy or a resource or a Gifford-giving robot?
So I debated on how much or little to put in this short time period, but mental representation is absolutely critical to all of those things. But I sectioned off the different parts here, which is sort of an arbitrary. They shouldn't be sectioned off because mental representation is really developmentally and structurally biased in particular ways. And so different kinds and patterns of mental representations may actually have quite different impacts on psychological states and on physiological states. And so I think the way I presented mental representation is sort of as if it's one thing, when it's actually a huge, diverse array of things. But to answer your question specifically, our capacity to develop highly complex, detached mental representation probably has a lot of play in our ability to make extreme or very novel connections and ideas. And those can be incredibly powerful. And I'll talk a little bit about this in the next lecture when we think about what people refer to as transcendent experience, or experiences that that appear beyond the material, and how that might really impact formal physiological systems and behavioral systems in connecting bonds or breaking bonds.
Thank you again for a fine lecture. At the beginning of the lecture, you raised the question of, is culture unique to humans? And you went on to suggest that we've been identifying certain social forms of behavior that suggest that culture isn't unique to humans. And then you sort of dropped that idea. I wonder if you wanted to comment a little further on that.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and I didn't mean to drop it. What I firmly believe the data suggest is that in most of our broad-scale definitions of culture, we cannot avoid recognizing the social complexity, the deep cultural patterns and processes in other organisms. And it's much more diverse, I think, than people are really willing. But if you look at what data are out there, that's absolutely, I think, accurate. However, evolutionary processes are about continuities and discontinuities. So we have some broad-scale continuities with what we would call social traditions of culture across mammals, let's say, or primates. But the discontinuity in the hominin lineage, particularly over the last 2 million years, I would argue has created some distinctive facets in this broader rubric of culture that has partitioned off particular components of the human cultural dynamic that I tried to lay out. And so rather than saying, what I wanted to do was say that it's not just humans and everything else is different. It's that there's a lot of similarities, but it's these particular patterns of difference that I think are of utmost importance when asking questions about the human. I think we could ask the same questions about cetaceans, about other primates, about birds. I think there's some very interesting things that we're overlooking because we're really focused on sort of a broad scale culture. I think chimp culture and corvid culture might be as important to understand in their own terms as human culture is.
Many thanks. Often when you were talking about the human niche or the cultural niche, you mentioned the word semiosis.
Yeah.
You suggested that humans live in a world of signs. And I wonder if you could explain how this world of signs differs, if it differs at all, from the life world in which all organisms live.
I think that's a good, so I brought up over the first few lectures, and I borrowed that term, ubiquitous semiotic ecosystem, from Terry Deacon, who sort of lays out what he means by that. But I think that, of course, all the world is filled with meaningful signs for organisms. That's the whole notion of Umwelt. I think Jacob von Uxküll laid that out brilliantly and beautifully, and I invoked the life world of a tick to sort of identify some of those things. But I think the particular evolutionary history of our genus Homo, indicates, at least in the archaeological and fossil record, I think we see material indications that much of that sign world, much of the semiotic landscape in which we exist, are signs that are actually created and manipulated by us or reconstructed by us more so than other organisms. Other organisms manipulate signs, engage with signs, and even create some novel signs. But I think that humans do so at a scale and a level of intensity and impact that radically alters. I think we construct our own ecosystems in that semiotic sense as much as interpreting the signs that are there. And so I think it's that increased manipulation of the world and our investment of meaning into the world and the creation of novel items of meaning that creates a distinctive ecosystem for humans relative to other organisms. Obviously, they're all connected, but I think there is something particularly interesting about the human capacity to imagine and to create that creates different kinds of potential dynamics in the semiotic ecosystem of humans than we might find for most other organisms.
I suppose I was just interested in hearing more about what you're really meaning by the notion of belief, as related to culture. I mean, in the sense, we all live in socially constructed environments, and in that sense, we all hold beliefs that are associated with that. But presumably you're talking about something which is quite a specific aspect of that. So kind of something more sort of heading towards religion or religious experience or something like that. Perhaps not. So I'd be interested in hearing that, and also why we don't believe as well, because in that sense, many of us don't. So is it sort of an automatic aspect of culture?
So yes and no. In 30 seconds or more or less, I'll try to recap the last 4 lectures. My point here is that belief, as I've defined it here, this capacity, right, to invest, to imagine, to commit, has to do with our capacity, our evolutionary histories in this development of a ubiquitous semiotic ecosystem, but also in which the way our bodies and societies work in development. And so I'm going to argue that the capacity to be religious and religion are one outcome of belief. But I would also say that economics, right? We have beliefs about exchange and value and context that are real for us, that are material, that are commitments, that come from the same capacity. And in the last lecture, I tried to draw some inferences archaeologically as to where some of those infrastructures come from. And so I see belief as this central capacity of the human. But the particulars of belief systems, I think, take very specific explanations to understand why particular patterns. As I'll talk about in the next lecture, though, I think there's something particularly interesting in this broader concept of religious as defined by Geertz, which I'll talk about, versus religion, let's say, as defined by Durkheim, which are different sort of concepts. But that's not the only way. Belief can be about that, but belief is a much broader context of the human experience.
A lot of the people who write about the differences between human and animal culture, we could call it, so this really follows on from the question you had from the front there about animal culture, point to one particular factor as the difference, and that's cumulative culture, which I don't think you really mentioned. And so one question is, why didn't you? Right. And the second question is, given there are controversies out there with some people saying that is what is unique about human culture, it's being cumulative, and others will say, no, there are cases from the non-human animal world. So 2 questions, really.
Yeah, well, no, as you know, I think that's a great question. So I nodded to cumulative culture over the last couple lectures in the archaeological record, but I don't want to sink that. I don't actually buy that as the most robust argument, because I think there's mounting evidence for cumulative culture in primates and cetaceans. And, as most of our assertions about what defines the human, the more we study other things, the less robust those definitions become. However, I do think that there are particular distinctive developmental and evolutionary trajectories in our genus that have facilitated particular kinds of neurobiological, behavioral, and ecological processes that I'm trying to illustrate as human culture that I think are particularly interesting in understanding the capacities for belief in the imaginary. I think I hesitate to place too much emphasis on cumulative culture, which is huge in humans, but it is not the defining moment. I don't think you can say humans have cumulative culture and nothing else does, because the data are beginning to come in that refute that. And I'm also very, very hesitant and have tried not to, any point here, do what so many of my predecessors have done in the study of human evolution to say, okay, now we found it. Stone tools, that's what made us human. No, that's not it. Art, that's what made us and not humans and not Neanderthals. No, that's not it either. So I don't think the dividing line is the important question. The important area of scientific inquiry is the distinctive trajectory of the lineage of interest. And so that's what I'm trying to focus on here.
In discussing belief, you've repeatedly referred to imagination. And that's a tricky thing to deal with empirically. If we operationalized it in terms of innovation or invention, and if we showed that there are other organisms that do show innovation and or invention, do we then credit them with belief?
That is the question I brought up that I would like to flesh out further. I'm focusing on the human here. So imagination, I think it would be almost impossible to make a good case that many other organisms, particularly organisms that develop tools or have very, very strong ecological manipulation, do not have imagination. I would find it almost impossible to develop a really good, well, you can develop very mechanistic explanations, but every time, again, we do that, they tend to fall down, at least on occasion. So what I would, and what I've done in my recent work, is to point out, again, humans have a particular pattern and context of imagination that I think ratchets, is cumulative in some ways, but also is more expansive because of particular evolutionary histories and because of this 2 million year history of archaeology. We are starting with a basis of material complexity that other organisms aren't today. And so I think direct comparisons of do you have imagination or not is again the wrong question. It is how do organisms or different lineages deploy those capacities that they have. And I'm particularly interested in the human capacity. I will not say, and in my previous book I took pains to point out that I think there's a distinctive human imagination, but it is not unique. That other organisms, not only imaginative, that we have our distinctive imagination in much of those capacities because we are primates and because we are highly social mammals. I think that gives us a baseline from which to work.
Augustine, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. I echo everything that has been said in your favor here. I wanted to ask you a very simple question, actually. I think that this lecture series so far, again, shows me, and what we've talked about before, that there's only one way to do that, is that through a newly revisioned way of thinking in interdisciplinary ways. For I can imagine what you're saying now about biology and how it breaks through the dualisms of nature and nurture and human evolution and other forms of evolution will force a new way of conceptualizing what happens in our disciplines and other disciplines. Do you think that is almost too much to bear for people to deal with individual project, or that one might also, if you're a philosopher or a theologian, decide, okay, all of that is wonderful, but I'm just going to follow the rules that we've constructed for this discipline?
So I will specifically address this point in my final lecture, but I'll summarize a couple of the key points here. First, I think C.P. Snow is wrong. I do not agree. He describes some problems and patterns, and there are many problems and patterns, but knowledge in the world does not come in the form of departments or disciplines. We created those to classify them and to follow them along. And I think we are now in a time of renewed interest in understanding that really good broad-scale research is often done in teams that are multi, if not transdisciplinary. And that if we're really interested in these larger processes, we need to draw from diverse sources of methods. What questions are we interested in, and what are the appropriate methods and theory to bring to those questions? I'm not so concerned, which is, as a head of a department, I shouldn't even say this, but I don't care what you call it. I want to know what are the methods and theoretical toolkits that you can bring to bear. And so, yes, it's extremely difficult and daunting, but that's why humans are so good at collaboration and imagining new teams and new possibilities. Now we just have to convince our universities and funding agencies to support those as well.
I was going to make a plug for universities. I mean, the universities are, in this country at least, currently challenged to demonstrate their value to society, and including value for money, but not just value for money, but value in general. Right. And I don't think universities are terribly good at it. Yeah. But the universities should be the home of interdisciplinarity, and that's exactly the point that I think comes across to me from listening to some of your talk. You know, there's massive scope for interdisciplinary working across social science, medicine, biology, anthropology, etc.
Well,
yeah. So the answers should come from universities.
Yeah. If we are honest and we're interested in these questions, we know that it's complicated, and we know that multiple disciplines need to be brought to bear. And universities are one of the last bastions where we have this opportunity to bring together different folks of interest in that way. And so I think we're incredibly lucky, but it's very, very difficult, right? Because we have to convince people with money externally.
But if we can't, if people like you can't convince them, then nobody else has got a chance.
Just drawing on from that last point, I was just wondering, so in about, I think it was around 2006, there was discussion of a sort of unified framework from an evolutionary psychology and biological point of view, which sort of sidelined anthropology. And I was just wondering whether you're actually seeing a sort of more interdisciplinary focus between those two opposing camps.
So, again, this is a long and politically charged answer, but I'll make it short and as apolitical as possible. There are plenty of people that don't want to play together. There are plenty of people who decide that this is the right way, that police the boundaries of disciplines and of knowledge formation. That's fine. They can continue to do that. Many of us, though, are not interested in policing boundaries and are actually interested in trying to ask robust questions and bring methodological toolkits to bear on those questions. And so I think what you're seeing is clusters of individuals who want to work together, who want to risk being wrong or being ignorant, which is the sort of baseline of science. That's what we do all the time, is demonstrate how wrong and ignorant we are and move forward slightly. I think that's becoming more and more common, and I think people are being trained more and more in certain areas to be open to that. There's always going to be discord. There's always going to be people policing the boundaries of disciplines, sometimes with good cause. But I think as we move forward, as knowledge ramps up, as the technology and information expands so dramatically, we're going to be left with no alternative but to draw on diverse fields of expertise and force ourselves to be intellectually generous and try to get at good answers, even if it takes longer, even if it's more complicated, and even if no single individual gets all the glory anymore.
Okay. I think that's a great note on which to finish. On behalf of the university, my sincere thanks to Agustín and to all of you for coming. Please contribute to the other bits of the series which are still to come, which I won't reiterate again, but there's more to come. We're not letting him quite off the hook yet. But thank you very much for joining us for the Gifford Lecture, and thank you again, Agustín.